Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. I'm Maiva Cifuentes, and I'm your host. And today I'm talking with Carter Severns. Hope I said
You
that
got
right.
it. Yep.
Who's the VP of Marketing at Place. And we are talking about a very interesting topic today, which is from SaaS marketing manager to VP or C level. What are the gaps that you need to bridge? So this, I think, is really valuable for a lot of people who are trying to grow in their careers as marketers. And Carter's here to tell us about his experience. How's it going, Carter?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here. Glad we finally got some time to chat. And yeah, I mean, that's a journey that I think most marketers either have been on or want to go on. And so specifically, I think we're going to talk a little bit more around like the financial side of things and SaaS metrics and those type of things that
Yeah.
help you kind of bridge the gap from being that maybe that individual contributor at the manager, middle level up to kind of more the executive and the way that kind of has to shift your mindset and the way you approach things. So excited to chat about it.
Yeah, so let's just talk real quick about you and the background in your career. How did you get to VP?
Yeah, excuse me. So my background is probably somewhat traditional in the sense that I came out of school. I went to school for advertising originally, and then just kind of stumbled into an internship in what was used to be called digital marketing. I don't know if they call it that as much anymore. I think that's just like demand gen now. But back then there was like this really fine line of like the digital marketing is a total different frontier than all the traditional channels. So I interned at a really big agency. And then shortly after that, my first full-time job was at a really large performance marketing agency with a huge international clients. And I was really just focused on Google Ads. Like that was the main channel that I worked on. And I was focused on, I worked on the Hilton account for a while. And then I worked on the Adidas account for a while. And throughout my time there, I just realized that if I wanted to be a marketing leader, I had to learn more than just Google Ads. I needed to learn multiple channels and other things that were, I didn't want to just be the best at paid search, right? Or what we called paid search. Now it's Google Ads, I think. But as I started asking to be like cross-trained or can I go shadow another team, I always got these like red tape of like, oh, you haven't been here long enough or you haven't done XYZ to go do that. So I started learning all these other things outside of my 9 to 5. I started these little side projects, building websites and learning how to run Facebook and Instagram ads because I knew that's where I wanted to go eventually. And truly, that's the reason I ended up getting out of that, Google Ads job to being a marketing manager at a small SaaS company. It's because I could go into the back end of WordPress and upload a blog and change pages and do copy and things that I'd never really learned in my 9 to 5.
Mhm.
And that's been a kind of a constant thread for me all the way through my career, is things that I've developed outside of work that have been able to kind of keep me competitive in the job space and be able to move up to where I am now, which is my second stint as a VP of marketing at a B2B SaaS company. So.
All right. So great career. A lot of people say it's really good to start in an agency because you can dip your hands in so many different things. But I guess if you're working on such massive accounts, then it kind of sounded like that's not what happened.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I do think that if you're going into a kind of a startup, earlier stage company, if you have done the agency thing and did okay and thrived in it, to me it's like the perfect mix of the two because it's still fast paced, it's very intense. You're going to get your hands on a lot of different projects and wear a lot of different hats. But it's focused on like one brand and one message
Yeah.
and one ICP or generally one industry. And that makes it easier for you to kind of hone in and perfect that. I will say, smaller agencies, you get to do a lot of things. That was a massive agency. I think there were like 17 of us just on the Hilton paid search team. Like
Oh,
that's how
wow.
big it was. And so that in that situation, that agency, it's in their best interest for us to just be really good at that channel. So I
Yeah.
get why they're set up that way. And there are people there who are now the VP of paid search that I worked for. And if like that's the trajectory you want to go on, by all means. I just knew that wasn't for me. So it just kind of depends on what you want and what career trajectory you want
Yeah.
to take.
All right. So let's talk about financials because that's one of the big things that you say makes a VP stand out from a manager. What are some things that a VP would know that most marketing managers don't?
Yeah, and so there's two routes to this in my mind. There's one side of it that truly is understanding the unit economics of how a SaaS business runs. That's one piece of it. The other thing, though, that I think is really critical is when you are in a meeting with other executives or you're in a meeting with a board, when you understand what's going on in the business and you put on the lens of I'm a business owner, I'm not just an individual contributor or a department head, it allows you to relate to your executives and the board in a totally different way. All of a sudden you can see what they're up against. You can understand
Yeah.
what your CEO is feeling from a pressure perspective or what he's trying to look at from a cash flow perspective and cash management. And so I think there are often times when you're at maybe that middle level, you don't get exposure to a lot of those things. It's usually your VP or your CMO who's sitting in those meetings, and you don't get to actually be a part of that. And then sometimes you get into those meetings, and because you don't understand some of the maybe the terminology or some of the things that are going on in the background, it's a harder learning curve to keep up with. Or maybe, sometimes I'm sure I did this. Maybe you say something kind of stupid because you don't realize what's being talked about, right? And so that's kind of the two ways that I look at it. Is you do have to understand truly like the numbers and the math behind it and understanding the P&L. But the other big piece as a executive is being able to build those relationships with
Mhm.
with your peers beyond just like executing on the job itself. So great example. My CEO talks about this all the time, but even at like the simplest level, understanding the difference between bookings, billings, and revenue. We're a B2B SaaS company that sells strictly into B2B SaaS. So we talk to SaaS leaders day in and day out. And you'd be shocked how many people have a different definition for those three things that I just said. And so that's one of the things where, my CEO, Brandon, who's a finance whiz, he's our CEO and our CFO because he just really gets that. And that's why I've learned so much too in my time here. But he's done talks in the past just around those three topics, and you'd be amazed how many CEOs are like, oh, now I understand the
Oh.
difference between those three metrics and why they're used in different ways. So that's just one example, the bookings, billings, and revenue thing. So
So, okay, but if you're a marketing manager and you generally are not getting into these conversations, how do you start getting into those conversations, or what do you do? Like, if you start to learn about it on your side, do you do strategy differently? Are you reporting differently? Or like, how do you use that information
yeah,
or even attain that information?
so hopefully if you are that marketing manager, director of marketing, hopefully you've got a VP or CMO that's willing to spend some time with you and walk through those things. I had a CRO in the past that was really good at bringing me into those conversations. And then eventually, when I was in board meetings, I was having to kind of speak to some of those metrics, which means you do have to spend some time learning and understanding it. But one of the things that I think about too is, in the interview process, you should be asking some of these questions about how does the CEO think about finance? What are the financial
Mhm.
KPIs and metrics that they care about? You should be asking about what's our cash runway, what's our average sales cycle, what's our average deal size, what's our net revenue retention, things that are just like core
Yeah.
critical numbers for a SaaS company. And that will give you a pretty good indication of how important it is to the CEO or to your manager. And then ideally you kind of know what you're getting into as far as like, are we a very financially savvy company that understands the metrics and all the different levers that can be pulled, or is that not going to be the case here? Because I've sat in both of those seats. Obviously we're a very financially focused company, but I've been in the past where it was like we're just kind of going month to month and figuring it out. And if things work, it's great. And if not, we'll kind of figure it out on the fly. Um, so the other piece of this too is like there's marketing metrics, right? That as a marketing person, you probably see every day. There's, you're looking at your cost per click or your, click through rate or even conversion rates, or maybe you do look at CAC as a sales and marketing, your cost per acquisition. But there's bigger things like understanding cash management and billing cycles. And if you're negotiating to bring HubSpot into your org into your tech stack, can you ask them, hey, can we do monthly billing because that helps us with the amount of cash coming in versus going out the
Mhm.
door, as opposed to being asked to pay for 12 months upfront? That's a huge chunk of change in one month. That if you are a SaaS company that's only billing monthly, you might not have enough cash coming in to cover a
Mhm.
$50,000 expense in one month, especially at a small company. So that's one of those things that understanding the bigger picture of the business really helps you put your finance goggles on and look through that lens.
So if you're okay, let's say you're a marketing manager, you don't know what you don't know. And I personally find, if you're going to go and ask somebody who's a C level or VP level, who's very busy, and you say, I want some guidance on here. I want you to help me figure this stuff out. But you don't want to be vague, right? You don't want to just say, help me understand what's important.
Sure.
Because they're going to be like, I don't know. I don't have time to think about this.
Yeah.
So I like to tell people, come with clarity on what you are trying to understand. What kind of questions would you ask? I mean, you listed some actually, like what are these metrics or what are the things that
Yep.
you track? But is there anything else? Like if you don't know anything about what they care about, what are the kind of things you would ask, and with what intent? Like how are you going to use that information after?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So there's a few. One that I don't think I mentioned is like, what's our burn rate? Meaning how much are we losing each month, which usually, venture backed SaaS companies are not cash flow break even. They're not usually profitable for a very long time. Understanding what the cash balance is versus the burn rate essentially gives you your cash runway, aka how many months are we in business if we don't close any new deals. That's a pretty good question to ask, right? And
Yeah.
what's really telling is if leadership doesn't have an answer for that question, it's pretty concerning. And I've been in situations where like the CEO and the CFO know the answer to that question, but nobody else on the leadership team has been, given access to that data, which in my opinion is never the right way to go about it. But I think asking questions like that as a marketer, you start to look at things through like almost binary. Like every dollar that we spend on LinkedIn ads either extends our cash runway or it shortens it. And
Hmm.
the cash runway is the end all be all metric as far as like how long we're in business for. And so when you start to look at it through that lens, it totally changes the way that you go about allocating budget and where you're going to spend it, because you're thinking again as the business owner, not so much as the
Yeah.
individual contributor. The other thing we think about is like LTV to CAC. So the lifetime value of a customer versus the cost of acquiring that customer. I think a lot of times people will look at CAC as like the total cost of sales and marketing versus maybe the first year ACV. Well, let's go back and take a step back and look at the total contract value plus what they average renewals are, and then you start to understand the unit economics of what it costs to acquire a customer versus the total cash that they're going to bring
Hmm.
to you in revenue. Um, that can totally paint a different picture than someone saying, our CAC is horrible, but they're only looking at how much revenue that customer brought in on the first year. Or maybe a total contract value without looking at what the renewal or average renewal rate is. So those are some of the questions that I think about. The other thing that's really, really simple to look at like the health of the overall business is NRR, so net revenue retention, which is basically how much cash came in and how much cash went out. So it's total revenue minus churn, which includes like expansions and upsells and cross sells, like all the revenue coming in the business versus going out. That has become a more popular metric, I think, in recent months. Because we've totally shifted this growth at all costs to like growth efficiency.
Yeah.
So those are some questions that I would be asking, and hopefully you've got a manager or a leader or someone in finance who's willing to sit down and kind of walk through those things with you, because truly it is a benefit to you in your career as you get into those executive meetings and having those conversations to understand what's being said and what is a heavy thing and what is scary or what is like not a big deal. So the more you know, I think the better armed you are.
So you mentioned that, okay, when you start to understand these things, you make different decisions. So you say, okay, well, now I know how this is going to impact this budget that I'm spending, for example. Are you learning these things because, I mean, I guess there's many different reasons, but are you going to try to show your manager how you're using this information, or the person that you're reporting to? Or are you just saving this information to experiment and bring it into a new job?
Uh, so it's interesting, right? As a marketing leader who's owning a number, right? So I own a budget number and I own a pipeline number, essentially. Like that's what I'm held to. Now, pipeline, obviously, you want to make sure that pipeline is translating into revenue, but at a certain point, that is out of my hands as a marketer. So we literally just went through this exercise a few months ago, as working through our budget for the year, and I'm looking at, okay, could we spend 50 grand on a 10 by 10 booth at some event? Or could we break that 50 grand, end up and go to 5 different events and not officially have a booth, but just be an attendee or a sponsor and try to set up dinners and have conversations? When you have very strict budget that you have to hit, you start thinking about more creative ways to get the most from that
Hmm.
budget. And then yes, you should be looking at, okay, we went to this event, it cost us X number of dollars, and what did that translate to from a MQLs to SALs to pipeline to revenue? Because at the end of the day, if as a marketing leader you're not tying your efforts to revenue, you probably won't have that seat at the table at the board meeting, is
Yeah.
truthfully what it comes down to. Like that VP of sales is going to be in there and they're going to speak for you, is essentially what happens. So yeah, I mean, the ultimate goal is always to be able to tie your efforts back to revenue. And then I've heard different ways that people split it, but usually it's like if you're hitting your revenue number, or you're hitting your pipeline number, you're usually given some grace. Maybe it's 20 to 30% where you're going to do some experiments. You're going to try some things. You might do a billboard, or you might do something that's, out of the ordinary, that you've earned because you've hit your pipeline number from the other 70 or 80% that you invested
Yeah.
specifically around that.
All right. So how financially literate do you have to be as a marketer?
Yeah, so this one's interesting because I'm not like a finance expert. I've always been more, especially I think most art marketers have always been more on the creative side. Like I've never been a mathematician. I always struggled with math growing up, but it's like, English and reading and writing was like, okay, I can do those things and I can excel at those things. So I think it really comes down to understanding the metrics in your business. I don't think you have to understand everything about SaaS finance, but you do need to understand what's important. Are we growth at all costs? Is it like
Yeah.
new logos is the goal and nothing else matters? Or are we really focused on, okay, for us right now, we're looking at, we've got a line in the sand that if we can hit the number of customers we want to hit, we will be cash flow break even by this date. That's the goal that we're working towards as a company, because then as a SaaS company at cash flow break even, your whole trajectory changes. You're in control of your own destiny at that point. So it's not like you have to be a finance whiz. I've got a few books that I've got that I've invested in. There's some guys like Ray Reich at RevOps Squared that do some really great content and really good webinars and benchmarking reports and things that you can kind of consume. Uh,
Hmm.
but I don't think you have to be a finance whiz, and it can be intimidating because there's a lot out there. You don't need to be the CFO. You have a CFO for that reason, and lean on that person. But I do think you have to spend the time to understand what is important in your company and understand what are your founders, what does your CEO care about? Are
Hmm.
they obsessed with CAC? Okay, well, let's deep dive into how we're calculating CAC. And so it's a little bit tricky, and it's not a great answer. But I don't think you have to be a finance whiz. I think you just need to be
Yeah.
understand enough to be dangerous and understand enough specifically to your business and what you're in. So when you're in those meetings, you understand what's being said and what's being asked and all that.
What do you do if your leadership team actually are not like they don't have that financial maturity? Like you mentioned that example before. You said it's a red flag. Okay, but you're in this company, so what do you do?
Yeah, so this is actually really topical. One of my really good friends is interviewing right now for kind of like a, head of marketing, director of marketing role. And so I was texting him and literally saying, here are the questions you should be asking. The things that I rattled off earlier. What's your burn rate? What's the cash runway? What's your average sales cycle? What's your maybe CAC to LTV? What's renewal rates? Hopefully you ask those questions before you get into the job, and that's a takeaway from this as a marketer who's interviewing, especially if you're interviewing at the executive like ownership level where you're going to have a number that you have to own. You better understand how hard it's going to be to get to that number and be able to back into it based on the economics within the
Mhm.
business. So truthfully, I don't have a great answer for that question besides saying like you should ask those questions up front before you hopefully get into that position. The other thing too is like hopefully you've got some level of transparency into the business. So maybe you've got monthly dashboards that the CEO shares in town hall meetings or something like that. Or
Mhm.
maybe you can deep dive into Salesforce or HubSpot and understand what's going on. And maybe you need to ask for access to some of those platforms where you can do some digging. But truthfully, it's I think it's important for everyone in a startup to have financial clarity and understand what's going on in the business because it's a part of something you've committed to. So hopefully you've asked those questions. If not, and you're in that business, you're in that position now, go seek out that information. Go ask it. I think if you've
Yeah.
got a finance person, uh, they should be able to get that information for you and ask your boss that same question. Like, hey, how, what does cash look like? I think it's a fair question for any employee to be asking that question.
Yeah.
And then if you've got leadership that won't share that with you, like that's another red flag as well, I think.
Yeah. Um, all right. Well, I feel like you've already answered this question, which was how much financial clarity can you really get as a mid-level manager?
Mhm.
But I feel like you just explained that. It's basically ask, and if they don't want to give it to you,
Yeah.
then
Yeah, and then I think one thing I go back to though is you've got to zoom out from just marketing metrics. So like a good example was looking at what like pipeline coverage, right? So based on your average close rate, you should know that you need 3x pipeline coverage to hit your number for the quarter. Maybe your close rate's a little lower and you need 5x to hit that number. But I think as a marketing manager, or even I think there's still a lot of VPs of marketing, they're just like, we've got to get 60 leads this month, and I don't care what happens downstream from that. which doesn't do you any favors when you're in a conversation with your VP of sales and they're frustrated because
Yeah.
there's not quality pipeline. So that's one of the things that we have a dashboard in Salesforce that is pulled up that shows me pipeline coverage in any given moment. And so that's something that I'm looking at every day. So that's one of those things, like you have to zoom out of just the marketing metrics and look at the metrics as business as a whole. And I think that will totally change the way you approach what you do in marketing.
All right, Carter, thanks. This has been really enlightening. What if people are like, okay, I get it now, but where do I go figure out more about this and prepare myself? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah. Um, I mentioned Ray Reich, who's a friend of ours. We've done a lot of stuff with them in the past. They've got a ton of great content.
How
Brandon,
do you spell Raikus?
so it's Ray Reich, Ray, and then Rike, and he's
Oh,
a
okay.
great resource. Also, Brandon, my CEO, who posts literally every single day on LinkedIn, is always sharing content like this. Another thing that we put together is this little nifty booklet here. It's
Okay.
a little black book of SaaS, and literally it is just filled with acronyms and metrics and reports and formulas and like all of the things that I've rattled off today, plus another 150 metrics are all in this little book.
Okay.
And maybe we can leave a link to this in the show
Yeah.
notes. We ship these out for free. So if you go to Place's website and fill out the form, we can drop one in the mail for you that you can keep on your desk. And what's kind of nice about it is at the back, we've got some notes where you can, add your own stuff in here. And every SaaS company kind of maybe has their own metrics that they track, and you can add those in. But this is even a good resource for me. I have one on my
Excellent.
desk every day, and when somebody's throwing out terms, we'll go look at them and see what they are. But yeah, I mean, those are a couple of really good resources. I found that there's a lot of good RevOps groups out there. Wizard of Ops is one of them that, it's really for RevOps folks. But as a marketing person, I'm interested in those things and I want to continue learning those. So there's a few just off the top of my head that are pretty good resources.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for that. And yeah, we'll drop the link to the little book of SaaS, little black book of
Perfect.
SaaS
Little black book of SaaS. Yep.
in the show notes. And yeah, thanks so much for spending this time with me today, Carter.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It was great chatting for sure.
Yeah, it was great. And if anybody wants to follow Carter, find him on LinkedIn. He's very active on there. And if you like this episode, let us know. Leave a comment, give it a like, share it with somebody. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks, y'all.